Today I am going to discuss the Nopane advertising strategy case for managerial statistics for the MBA program at UW River Falls under Professor Kelly. Nopane is a mature over-the-counter drug that has the same advertising strategy for the last decade. Nopane is an important drug in the marketplace, but not necessarily dominant. It has about 15% of the market share. I am the new product manager, and I'm going to try and see if changing up the advertising strategy will increase our sales. So I tested two kinds of advertising, emotional and rational, meaning emotional appealing to the touchy-feely sort of side to advertising the drug, and then a rational approach. I also looked at what spend we should possibly advertise at. I have a low level of spend, a medium level, and a high, and how we interpret this factor is $2.50 spend for every 100 potential customer in that area. I also looked at the East Coast versus the Midwest, the East and West Coast versus the Midwest, to see if there were differences in different areas of the country. I collected this data over a 6-month period, a 6-month test period in the market in 2 different sales territories. So my total number of observations is 24 because I have 2 types of advertising times 3 level of spend times 2 segments in 2 sales territories, and that's how we came up with 24 observations. Again, looking at the unit sales observed here, we had a minimum of 26 and a max of 40 with an average of 30.6 in our observations. And then also one thing we looked at later in the case is the competition spend on advertising, again, and to be interpreted the same way as above, $10 being the minimum, 34 at the max, $19 average spend for the competition for every 100 potential customers. So the first thing, before we start, I wanted to mention something here. In looking through the data during this test period, I did notice that we didn't necessarily have perfectly linear relationships with the data. There appears to be some exponential or quadratic relationships. Also, there's some heteroscedasticity in the model. So what we did is, for the observable data, I went ahead and took the log of the observable data to kind of control for those factors. Also, common sense would tell us that yes, there's probably a positive relationship between advertising spend and an increase in sales, but it's not necessarily, common sense would tell us that it's not necessarily linear, because at some point in time, more spending on advertising isn't going to increase the sales. At some point in time, you can't create more demand for an over-the-counter medicine. At some point in time, everybody will have enough and there won't be any more demand for it. With that said, we're going to look here at the first box plot, looking at differences in the advertising type versus sales. Here we see that for the rational type of advertising, our observations show us that our sales are higher than when we have emotional advertising in that area, but also the variance is a bit wider. Next, I looked at the segments A and B, meaning the coast versus the Midwest, to see if there was a difference in sales there, but we're really not seeing any evidence there that there's a difference in different areas of the countries for the sales. The variance is about the same, and also the means are about the same when it comes to unit sales. So again, not much evidence here that there's a difference in the segments. When controlling for both, what we looked at before, both the type of advertising and the segment of area, again, this shows us again that if we look at the A's or look at the coasts for these 2 boxes versus these 2 boxes in the Midwest, if you compare the 2 versus 2, there's really not a lot of difference. But if we look at, again, the 2 emotional boxes, which is the first and the third box, and the rational type of advertising, which is the second and the fourth box, they're about the same, relatively. So again, this is further evidence that there is not much difference between segments A and B, meaning the coasts and the Midwest, but there is still a difference between emotional and rational type of advertising when we're looking at the unit sales. Here we're looking at our advertising dollars, the level of spend versus the log of unit sales. So we have our observations here, the $2.50, the $4.75, and $8. And what we're seeing here is a positive relationship, which confirms our suspicions from before that there is a positive relationship between advertising dollars and unit sales. So as we spend more, we see that we're also selling more. However, it is important to note here that the range or the variance at the highest level of spending is much wider, or the risk is greater. So we're spending more, but the observations could possibly be all over the place. Yes, the mean's a little higher, but there is more risk the more we spend. Here's where we came to the aha moment in the observations. So what we have here in these first three boxes is the emotional type of advertising, and with the breakout of the different levels of spend. The second three boxes here is for the rational observations, the rational type of advertising at each level of spend. Notice these two relationships are very, very different from one another. So we know just by looking at this data that, yes, emotional versus rational gives us very different results from one another. So another interesting thing to note here is that for emotional versus rational over there on the right side, the variance is a lot higher. When we control for the level of spend, emotional advertising has a lot bigger variance than rational, whereas before, when we weren't controlling for the level of spend, it looked like the emotional variance was a lot lower, but the rational was higher in variance. But what we're seeing here is, as we spend a little bit more money on the emotional mid-level, we get we see higher sales, but as we spend even more, the sales go lower. Perhaps customers or people looking at TV advertisements get a little bit annoyed at the touchy-feely commercials after a while, and they decide to buy something else. Who knows? So we're not seeing an improvement from the mid to the high, but we do see one from the low to the mid. I do want to make a comment about what this relationship kind of looks to me like if we're ignoring the rational over there on the right. This does appear to be kind of a quadratic relationship, mirroring y equals negative x squared, perhaps. It does appear to be quadratic. It's definitely not looking linear. So going over to the rational, we have low level of spending, middle, and high level of spending. Here we're seeing a definite positive relationship. So the more we spend, the more we are seeing in sales. And again, what we want to note here too is the variance is a lot lower in the rational advertising observations when we control for the level of spending as compared to the emotional. So that is very interesting here. This relationship under rational, again, it appears to be linear or exponential. But common sense would probably tell us that it's exponential because, like I said before, at some point in time, you can't spend any more money and create demand here. So again, this relationship kind of looks like y equals the ln of x. When I presented these findings to the vice president, he said, well, you're forgetting an important factor. What about the competition's expenditure on advertising? And so I did go ahead and look at it. There does appear to be a slightly negative relationship between what the competition is spending on advertising versus our sales, which makes sense. If a competitor drug is being advertised heavily, perhaps customers will buy that drug instead of ours. And again, I looked at the emotional versus rational because the data is kind of telling us so far that that's probably significant. And again, we are seeing the negative relationship, just like above, but the irrational, which is the blue X's, it appears to be a little bit of a steeper slope than the emotional observations here. So taking that into consideration, when the competition is spending more money, we might see a deeper decline in our unit sales when we're advertising rationally versus emotionally. So I did look at this factor. However, when I ran the model, it showed up. It came out to be insignificant as a factor on our sales. Also, the segment and the spending on types of segment and the competition, the competition spending on what segment and the ad dollars by segment, that all came up insignificant as well in the model per our suspicions before from looking at the data. So here in this model, we see that the type of the copy or the emotional versus rational and the spending is significant, which we kind of suspected from before. So here, how we interpret this 0.34 here is as a 1% increase in advertising expenditure. In general, our sales are going to go up by 0.34% units. But what's interesting here is, if you remember from before, the emotional was the 1 and rational was the 0. So if we have a 1 here, we're seeing that as we spend more on the emotional, 1% more, our unit sales are going to go down by 0.38%. So again, this is kind of showing us that maybe we'd want to spend the money on the rational versus the emotional. So I ran some regression residuals just to make sure that the models checks out okay, and it does. We have a spread on actual versus fitted for unit sales, and for the ad dollars there's a spread as well at the 3 levels. Actual predicted looks pretty good, and then our QQ plot for the residuals, they seem to follow the line pretty good. There's a little bit of a pattern here, but in general they look pretty good. Also, the residuals are normally distributed, so that's a great thing to see. Had they not been, we might have had an issue with the data. So based on this model and looking at the types, the copy type is definitely significant. The emotional advertising seems to be effective at a moderate level of spend, but too much is ineffective. And also, there is a high variance at each level of spend for emotional. That signifies that there's some risk. So I would not recommend spending on emotional advertising for this drug. For the rational advertising, the higher spending gives us higher sales, and the variance is small. So I would recommend here that we would spend the $8 per 100 prospective customers to see our sales increase at the highest level. Now, there are some possible threats to this model. First of all, we only tested a 6-month period, and that 6-month period could have been winter versus summer, where more drugs are demanded. We only have 24 observations, which is the most obvious threat to this data. I would like to see a much wider testing area, much more observations. I would want at least 100, possibly 2 testing periods, like I said, and then there could be possibly omitted variables. So we could be forgetting what season we're in, what age groups are in these sales territories. For example, if one of the sales territories has a high concentration of 30-year-olds and the other one has a high concentration of 70-year-olds, that could have skewed the data. So we would want to make sure that our populations, the age of our populations are normally distributed, those kinds of things. So there are some threats to the data. I mean, first of all, I would start out with gathering a lot more observations, different territories, and of course doing another 6-month period or possibly over the course of the year. So thank you for your time today.